What if David never became king? What if the greatest king in biblical history had never been crowned? What if Israel's destiny had followed a different, darker, more unpredictable path? David, the anointed one, the hero, might have been just a shadow of a future that never came to pass. Sometimes what never happened defines who we are more than what actually occurred. But what if I told you that David's rise to power wasn't a divine act, but a series of mistakes and wrong choices? What if someone else had taken the throne? The history of Israel, the faith that built an empire, and even the prophecies that would guide us for millennia could have been reversed. As the truth unfolds, one question troubles the mind. What would really have happened if David had never been king? And who paid the price for it? The story we've been told begins with the absolute certainty that David was inevitable, an unlikely shepherd, chosen by God, destined for the throne even before he understood his own name. But this narrative, repeated for centuries, ignores a disturbing detail. The anointing is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning of a possibility. Nothing, at that moment, guaranteed that David would survive long enough to be king. Nothing ensured that Saul would fall when he did. And above all, nothing proved that the throne was vacant by divine will, and not by a sequence of human failings, convenient silences, and decisions made far from official records. What happens when we remove David from the center of history? When we imagine an Israel without its most celebrated king, without the Psalms that shaped its faith, without the lineage that would define the spiritual future of millions? What remains is not just a theoretical exercise but a historical abyss, an unstable kingdom, suspended prophecies, and a succession that could have followed a completely different path, perhaps more cruel, perhaps more rational, perhaps darker. This is not an account of what happened, but of what almost happened. Of a breaking point where fate hesitated. Because if David had never been king, history wouldn't simply have changed. It would have been forcibly rewritten, erasing names, adjusting versions, and transforming survivors into legends. And that's precisely where the real mystery begins. Israel at that time was not a consolidated kingdom, but a fractured body struggling to stay afloat. Tribes were united more by fear of the enemy than by loyalty to one another. Borders were unstable, alliances were fragile, and leadership was already showing signs of weariness. Saul still occupied the throne, but his authority was sustained more by the memory of past victories than by genuine respect. The people felt this. There was a silent weariness in the air, a distrust that was not spoken aloud but shaped every decision. The cities murmured. The elders watched. The prophets spoke in riddles. Nothing seemed solid. The constant presence of the Philistines pressed down on Israel like a blade against its neck, and any mistake could mean its ultimate downfall. In this unstable scenario, the emergence of a new leader would not be an act of faith, but a desperate political maneuver. David's anointing took place in this tense atmosphere, far from public celebrations, hidden as if even heaven feared to announce what was to come. But what if that environment had never allowed David to emerge? What if war had come sooner? What if Saul had acted more forcefully? What if fear had prevailed over hope? In a kingdom where survival came before prophecy, any promise could be crushed by the weight of reality. And perhaps that is exactly what almost happened. Because in that fractured Israel, destiny did not move in a straight line. It stumbled, hesitated, and threatened to collapse at any moment. The first sign that David might never reach the throne didn't come in the form of a direct threat, but something far more dangerous: indifference. After the secret anointing, nothing changed immediately. No visible divine protection, no sudden ascension, no official recognition. David returned to anonymity, to the fields, to simple tasks, as if fate itself had decided to wait. This initial silence was the true warning, because in a world driven by power and urgency, that which doesn't assert itself quickly is usually swallowed up. When David finally appears before the public, it is not as an heir but as a musician, a young man called only to calm Saul's unstable mind. There, so close to the throne, he was still invisible. And even after the victory against Goliath, recognition came accompanied by something darker: envy. Popular songs began to reshape the people's perception, exalting David above the king. It was at this moment that the story almost broke down. Saul reacted not merely as an insecure man but as a cornered ruler. Assassination attempts, persecutions, veiled orders. Each spear thrown was a concrete possibility that the narrative would end there. And it almost did, because all it took was one mistake, one misstep, one poorly chosen night. The first warning sign was clear. The future of Israel depended on the survival of a young man who should already be dead. And when destiny comes to depend on constant flight, it ceases to seem inevitable and begins to seem improbable. In those days of persecution and uncertainty, someone was watching. Not a declared enemy, but someone within the inner circle. Someone whose loyalty was in constant conflict with his own survival. Jonathan, Saul's son, was more than a passive witness. He was a figure caught between two worlds, the blood tie to the king and the growing friendship with young David. In a way, he represented the last hope that something could be done, that someone could intercede to prevent David's destruction, or prevent the kingdom's future from being altered. Jonathan knew the threat David posed to his own future, but he also knew that something was deeply wrong with his father's kingship. David's courage on the battlefield, his humility in the face of power, and even his ability to inspire the people contrasted sharply with Saul's growing tyranny and paranoia. However, Jonathan could not avoid the dilemma forming in his heart. If David were king, his own future, his own legacy, would be in danger. And if Saul remained on the throne, Israel would live under a constant shadow of instability and violence. While others saw only the confrontation between father and son, Jonathan saw something deeper: the struggle for Israel's survival and, perhaps, the choice between two lineages. He tried everything to preserve David's life, but he knew that each act of betrayal against Saul could be the last arrow fired against his own family. Witnessing all of this, he could not act without paying a very high price. The story he witnessed was not just the struggle of two men, but the invisible battle between what could be and what was already predestined. Jonathan might be David's last chance to be saved, but in a world where blood ties and honor define everything, he knew his friendship with David was being treated as betrayal. The dilemma was clear. He could witness David's rise, or he could be the last defender of his father's legacy, a legacy that perhaps even he no longer believed was worthy of being preserved. The growing tension between Saul and David did not go unnoticed by everyone. Although the court was divided, some more astute observers began to realize that something was very wrong in the corridors of power. It wasn't just Saul's silent shouts, the paranoia in his orders, or the furtive glances exchanged among the soldiers. There was something more, something hidden in the details, in the subtext of a narrative told and retold by those who still dared to question the status quo. The investigation was neither official nor planned. It was more of a series of questions asked in the shadows, a growing whisper among those closest to the king. The once loyal court began to question itself. How could Saul, a man anointed by God, be so ruthless? Why did his obsession with David transcend any question of leadership or justice? Those who dared to investigate more deeply, scouring ancient documents, forgotten prophecies, and accounts from the people, began to perceive a disturbing pattern. David's apparent divine choice was not as clear-cut as it had been thought. In a scenario where absolute power trumps truth, the echoes of what was being hidden became impossible to ignore. Ancient prophecies spoke of an anointed king, but said nothing about how he should ascend the throne, or what should occur before his ascension. What researchers found was not a confirmation of divinity, but a series of open possibilities. In the silence of libraries, in forbidden conversations between scholars and advisors, an obscure theory began to emerge. Perhaps David's ascension was not part of a divine plan, but a misguided succession, an interruption of royal destiny. The question that arose was not only about what Saul would do next, but about what might have happened if David had never been chosen. Who then would take his place? The people knew something was wrong, but the consequences of questioning what was being imposed were profound. Those who began to investigate in secret knew they were risking more than their careers or their lives. They were about to challenge history and, perhaps, change the future of Israel forever. Amidst the escapes, the makeshift alliances, and the deathbed decisions, one object went almost unnoticed in official accounts, but never by those who knew where to look. It wasn't a legendary weapon or a symbol of war, but something far more dangerous, a sign of legitimacy. A simple artifact yet laden with political and spiritual weight, capable of defining who had the right to rule and who should be forgotten by history. This object emerged when David was already a hunted man, living among caves and enemy borders. During a silent encounter, far from Saul's eyes, he received something few men dared touch without royal authorization, an object that did not belong to him, but which could be used to prove his claim, or to condemn him. The most disturbing thing was not what the object represented, but the fact that its existence was never widely publicized. It appears only indirectly, diluted in ambiguous passages as if someone had decided to downplay its importance. For some scholars, that object was confirmation that David was still in the game. For others, it was proof that everything could have ended there. If it had been discovered, if it had fallen into the wrong hands, the narrative of chosen king would have been replaced by usurper. The line was too thin. Possession of that symbol did not guarantee the throne. It only made the fall quicker if it were revealed. What makes this object truly mysterious is its subsequent disappearance. It ceases to be mentioned as if it had fulfilled its purpose or as if its mere memory were too dangerous. And this raises an uncomfortable question. Did history omit this detail because it weakened the idea of a clear destiny? Because it showed that David was not only guided by God, but also by risky, almost illegitimate choices? If David had never been king, this object would be seen today not as a symbol of hope, but as proof of a historical error. And perhaps that is precisely why it has been swallowed by silence. After the object, something even more unsettling followed. Absolute silence. Not just the absence of records, but a narrative void that extends across events that should have been decisive. Moments when decisions were made, alliances sealed, betrayals avoided or consummated, and none of it was clearly described. The story simply moves on, as if there were nothing noteworthy. But the silence, in that context, speaks louder than any account. David remained alive but invisible. Saul remained king, but increasingly isolated. And between these two poles, Israel plunged into a strange, almost unnatural pause. No clear prophecy, no explicit divine intervention, no public confirmation that David's path was still intact. For a man supposedly chosen by God, heaven seemed dangerously quiet. This silence affected not only David, but also those who believed in him. Followers began to question, soldiers hesitated, tribal leaders calculated risks. Because, in a world where power is asserted through signs and victories, the absence of confirmation is interpreted as abandonment. And abandonment, at that time, was synonymous with slow death. What is most disturbing is that this silence coincides with clear opportunities to end the story. Saul was vulnerable. David had real chances to kill him and take control. But he didn't. Not out of weakness, but out of fear of what might happen if he broke the last line that still linked him to legitimacy. God's silence forced him to act as a man, not as the chosen one. And that made every decision more difficult. If David had never been king, this period would be seen as the exact moment when everything was lost. When the inaction, coupled with the absence of signs, almost convinced the protagonist himself that perhaps he was never destined for anything other than escape. The silence was not just an interval in the story, it was a cruel test. A test that could very well have ended with David disappearing from the narrative forever. The reversal came not as a triumph but as a shock. When Saul finally fell, it was not at the hands of David, nor through an elaborate plan, nor through divine justice staged before the people. It was in the chaos of war, far from the control of any clear prophecy. The king's death did not immediately pave the way for David. On the contrary, it plunged Israel into a dangerous vacuum. And it was in this void that history almost took a definitively different turn. The expectation was that David would be immediately accepted as successor. But that didn't happen. Part of the kingdom refused to recognize him. Another name was raised. Another lineage claimed continuity. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, became the symbol of a legitimate alternative. For the first time, the question ceased to be, when will David be king? And became, what if he never is? The turning point was not David's ascension, but the realization that he could be rejected. Internal wars ensued not for faith but for power. Tribes chose sides not based on prophecy but on convenience and fear. David ruled partially without full authority, surrounded by allies who could turn against him at any moment. The image of the inevitable king began to unravel, revealing something more human, more fragile. This moment is crucial because it shows how close history came to being forever fragmented. If the balance had tipped even slightly to the other side, David would have been remembered not as king, but as the leader of a defeated faction. A secondary name, perhaps respected, perhaps forgotten. The reversal exposed the uncomfortable truth. The throne was never guaranteed. It was contested, negotiated, and conquered on unstable ground, where fate almost lost control of its own narrative. As the kingdom began to divide, a feeling began to silently spread among the people. Fear. Not the fear of an external enemy, but the fear of themselves, of what Israel was becoming. Tribes that once marched together now watched each other with distrust. Every political decision seemed to carry the risk of full-blown civil war. The people sensed, even without understanding all the details, that something had gone awry. David's name, which should have symbolized hope, began to cause apprehension. For some, he was the promise of stability. For others, he was a sign that the kingdom would never heal from the wounds inflicted by Saul. Contradictory stories circulated, accounts of bravery mixed with rumors of ambition, devotion mixed with suspicion. The collective fear did not stem from what David did, but from the uncertainty about who he really was and what he could become. This fear was fueled by official silence. There was no single narrative being imposed. Each tribe told its own version, and where there was no explanation, theories arose. Some said that God had abandoned Israel for rejecting Saul. Others believed that David was merely a temporary instrument destined to fail. The most dangerous thought was the unspoken one. What if there was no one else chosen? Collective fear creates invisible monsters. It causes decisions to be made out of panic, not conviction. Men armed themselves not to protect themselves but to anticipate betrayals. Leaders took defensive positions, preparing for a future that no one could foresee. If David had never been king, this period would be remembered as the beginning of the end for Israel, as a unified nation. The real threat wasn't political division, but the loss of faith in a common purpose. When people stop believing that history has direction, any leader becomes disposable. And at that moment, David was dangerously close to becoming just another name lost amidst the collective fear. It was in this climate of fear and uncertainty that something began to circulate that should never have been spoken aloud. It wasn't a direct accusation, nor an outright heresy, but an idea too dangerous to survive in the light of day. The forbidden theory questioned the very foundation of the narrative. What if David had never been the final plan? What if the anointing had been merely a temporary fix, not a definitive choice? Some elders, scholars, and tribal leaders began revisiting ancient texts, fragmented prophecies, and hastily made decisions. What they found was not an explicit contradiction, but an uncomfortable ambiguity. The scriptures spoke of a king after God's own heart, but never stated that this king would rule flawlessly, nor that his lineage would be the only possible one. The theory suggested that David might have been merely a response to Saul's failure, not Israel's ultimate destiny, but an attempt. The danger of this idea lay not only in denying David, but in opening the door to something even more unstable. The notion that the throne was not sacred. If kings could be chosen, rejected, and replaced according to human circumstances, then power ceased to be divine and became political. This threatened not only David, but the entire system that held the people together. The forbidden theory was never officially refuted. It was simply suppressed. Because if it were true, it would explain too much. God's silence, the division of the kingdom, the fragility of David's rise to power. It would explain why everything seemed so improvised. If David had never been king, this theory wouldn't be forbidden. It would be accepted as truth. And perhaps that's precisely why it needed to disappear. The search for answers didn't end with a clear revelation, but with collective exhaustion. Those who questioned too much began to disappear from the political scene, not necessarily dead, but silenced, sidelined, absorbed by the forced normality that settles in after long periods of chaos. The kingdom needed to move forward, even if it didn't know exactly where. And, little by little, the question ceased to be, should David be king, and became, how do we make this work now? When the resistance finally dissolved, it was not through spiritual conviction, but through exhaustion. Internal wars had drained resources, lives, and hope. The people wanted stability, any stability. David was accepted not as the fulfillment of an ancient promise, but as the only remaining option. This ended the quest, but did not answer the questions that had given rise to it. This moment marks a delicate point. When history chooses to end an investigation, not because it has found the truth, but because it can no longer bear the uncertainty. David's coronation, in this context, seems less a divine act and more a tacit agreement, an attempt to rebuild something that had already been broken. If David had never been king, the quest would have continued, perhaps even completely destroying the idea of a unified kingdom. But because he was crowned, the narrative could be sealed. The doubts did not disappear. They were merely pushed to the margins, where they transformed into historical murmurs forgotten by most. The end of the search did not bring absolute peace. It brought control. It brought direction. And it brought the urgent need to rewrite events in a way that made sense. The story needed a final point. Even if that point was built upon layers of silence, concessions, and incomplete truths, the revelation did not come as an immediate shock, but as a belated fitting of pieces that had always been in plain sight. When David finally establishes himself as king, something subtly changes in the way the story is told. The most ambiguous episodes are softened, the flaws gain spiritual justifications, and the moments of doubt are reinterpreted as tests of faith. The revelation is not about what happened, but about how it came to be narrated. Looking at the sequence of events, it becomes impossible to ignore an uncomfortable fact. David did not win because fate was inescapable, but because he survived long enough for all alternatives to be eliminated. Saul died. His son fell. Rivals disappeared. The revelation is this: the throne was not taken in a single act of divine choice, but built upon a succession of absences. This doesn't turn David into a villain, but it removes him from the pedestal of inevitability. He was king because he remained when all other paths were closed. The true revelation is that Israel didn't follow David out of absolute certainty, but out of a lack of options. And once crowned, the kingdom needed to believe that this had always been the plan. If David had never been king, the revelation would have been too obvious. The system failed, the prophecy was misinterpreted, and history took a different course. But because he was king, the revelation had to be diluted, hidden in layers of poetry, faith, and tradition. In the end, the darkest revelation is not that David almost wasn't king. It's that history, as we know it, depended more on human contingencies than on divine certainties. And that changes everything. David's legacy doesn't begin with his coronation, but with the need to justify everything that came before it. Later kings, priests, scribes, and spiritual leaders needed to transform an unstable path into a straight line. The legacy wasn't just governing Israel, but making sense of the chaos that nearly destroyed the kingdom. And to do that, history had to be shaped. The Psalms attributed to David are not merely expressions of faith, but emotional records of someone who lived on the brink of oblivion. They carry fear, guilt, hope, and a constant search for divine validation. This literary legacy helped solidify the image of a chosen king, even when his trajectory suggested otherwise. A man who could have been forgotten. If David had never been king, there would be no Davidic lineage, no messianic promise as we know it, no same structure of faith built upon his descendants. The legacy, therefore, is not merely political or spiritual, but narrative. It defines the past as much as the future. What is most disturbing is realizing that David's legacy exists, because the kingdom needed to believe in him. Faith was built on the victory of survival, not certainty. David became a symbol not because it was inevitable, but because he overcame time, silence, and doubt. In the end, the true legacy is not the reign itself, but the question that never completely disappears. What if he had never been king? Because this question reveals something essential about human history. Sometimes, the world we know is not the result of destiny, but of what almost didn't happen.